Okay, we just went into an interesting situation that precipitated this discussion. And that is the cutting out of labels, okay? Now, what was happening is, we set up this job. This happens to be a flood-coated job on white, pressure-sensitive material. And we have what's called a shape die rather than a kiss cutter, butt cutter. This is called a shape die. So we have a shape die, and we're cutting out these rectangular shapes with radiuses in the corner. This is a very common shape, very common situation. Okay? Now, when we do this, and when you have labels that end up being these little shapes left, usually the matrix, what we call the waste matrix, gets pulled away. The waste matrix gets pulled away in the process and wound up onto a separate roller for that purpose, while the product rolls get wound up. And so this waste matrix gets pulled away. Right? And we end up with this. Now, in the process of setting up the web and working with the print and whatnot, we kept discovering that the web was snapping. We didn't understand what was going on. And I went to peel a label up, and I was able to push my fingers through one of these labels. And this is not happening readily here, but that's what happened. Which is a very excellent thing for us to talk about, because here's something that might happen as you go to your future, okay? To the future. I'll start by saying that, and then I'll describe what I'm talking about. If a label is not cut deeply enough, it's not going to peel away. That's an obvious problem that you're going to identify and fix right quick. But what if you're cutting too deeply? There is the possibility to cut too deeply. Okay. All right. First, we'll start with the defect. That the web snapped was a hint. You can see the impressions, guys, on the back of the paper. You see those impressions there? But the real teller is right there on the front. Look at it. You see that? You're not supposed to see that.
Okay? You're supposed to cut through.
You're supposed to just cut through the top layer and not cut into the release layer. Okay? So now we're going to talk about how that can happen and what we might be able to do about it. Okay? But that's our problem. Our problem is these labels are being cut too deeply into the line. The way to tell the problem is we have the web pop, and more importantly, you can see that scoring into it. Now, what does that potentially do to us? Besides, that's one thing. Besides it weakening the web, and this is what it does. Now this is where we get into the discussion. All right. A die is a rotary cookie cutter. Right? But now you have pressure-sensitive material consists of the paper layer or the substrate. The main portion of the substrate, because this could all be considered a substrate, but this is just a vehicle for getting these labels to the package or to the bottle or whatever. By the time this label goes to where it is, this is no longer of any use. So it's just a carrier for the purposes of printing and transport and getting it to the customer and getting it on that product finally, whether it be auto-applied or manually applied. All right? So the substrate, the main substrate we'll call in this discussion the paper layer. But when it's not necessarily paper, it could be a poly of some sort as well or some other material. Then you have another layer here, that's your liner. Or release liner. If my words are wrong, it doesn't matter. The concept doesn't matter, okay? Above, on this thing, it's like a little wax paper right above it. There's a little silicone type, or perhaps other material, that facilitates the release. Okay? That's why it's called a release layer. And then on the bottom of this substrate is an adhesive appropriate for the final application, and that happens to work with this release liner. Okay, everything works, so on. Now what happens? A die has a profile, okay? If we look at the cutting edge of a die, it has a profile. Depending on the material, that profile may be like this, or like this, sharper. Now, some materials require this function. And I'm not an expert at die cutting or anything like that, but our die manufacturers understand this. And they will study the paper sample you send them and make an appropriate profile based on the material you're cutting. For example, this type of profile will cut through paper more easily, but perhaps that's wear problems. And I don't know all of those deciding factors. But the important thing is here, the profile may be driven by the substrate. That's an important thing. So a profile, a die and a shape and everything that cuts one material, if the same shape is required of another material, it might not work for that material. It might not be appropriate. It might experience poor quality or rapid wear, accelerated wear. That's an important part of the die specification. The other important part of the die, the more obvious part, is just how deep that tip comes down. What happens is, when that tip is trying to come down, you have your bearers out here, right? And these tips are either exactly flush with the bearer, in the case where the shape is being completely cut out, you may run what's called tag stop, board stop, and at the end of the day, when it comes out the machine, little tabs come out or something like that, or something one on a roll, but it's been cut all the way through. A butt cut die is also an example of that, where it completely cut through your sheet or a sheeter die. In other cases, the bearer may come down a little bit deeper, so that the knives cut through the top layer, but not into the bottom paper. That's why your manufacturer not only wants a piece of sample to confirm, but also, depending on the thickness of this backing, the thickness of this backing factors into the depth and the specification of that die. So when you order the die, they need to know if it's this pound or that pound. I don't know the exact pounds. These things come in, it may be 50, 72 pounds, 42, I don't know the exact. It doesn't matter. Some are thinner and some are thicker. And it may need to be thick for a purpose, whatever. You know, the liner is going to be driven by its purpose, and then the die will then say, okay, if that's the thickness of the back, then this is how deep we need to cut. So let's say that you have a paper that is, let's say that this die was made, let's say in this case, what's a possible cost for this? Possible cost for this is that this paper is thicker than the paper this die was specified for. Okay? That's one possibility. It could have been specified incorrectly. This paper could be incorrect. Whatever. But apparently, this paper and this die are not an appropriate match. What can we do about it? Alright.